Karen, are you okay to talk about ParentPing and the type of work that you've been doing in the UK?
Yes, so I'm in the car now, so I'll do this bit and then we'll try and drive home. Oh, sorry, that's the radio on. Ping is a bit like TeachTap, which some people might have heard of before, in that we ask parents 3 questions a day, and we've been doing this throughout the lockdown period. So we launched in June last year, and so the main data that I've got to share with you today is from the second lockdown in England, which happened between January and March, and so we've been looking at what happened during home learning during that period.
And can I ask you, now we have you, also to talk a little bit about, I mean, I remember you saying that some of the findings from ParentPing were also around the role of fathers, right? And also understanding what homeschooling looked like in the UK.
Yeah, in terms of what it looked very different in this most recent block of homeschooling, so the 2021 homeschooling, compared to when we had it, when the virus first emerged in 2020. But having said that, it was very varied across schools. So in some schools, up to half the pupils were still in. So schools in England were still open to learners who were classed as vulnerable. So they might have had a special educational need. They might have been living in poverty. It was also open to key workers, which means our medical professionals, but also people who work in supermarkets and things like that. So up to half the kids were still in school, and the teachers were having to work out how to provide for that. Just over half of schools provided some sort of online lesson, particularly for English and maths. But it's really hard to say what was happening across the whole country, because actually every school coped a little bit differently, and therefore all parents had to cope a little bit differently.
Yeah, so some of the outcomes from ParentPing also talk about the number of hours that parents would spend on homeschooling, right? And the role of fathers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the government said that schools should provide, for primary schools, 3 hours of learning a day. And actually that seems to have translated in very much into what happened. So certainly for the first 3 weeks of our lockdown, around 70% of parents reported that their kids spent 3 hours or more a day doing their homeschooling activities. It dropped off a little bit after that, and plateaued at around 50 to 60% of parents saying that more than 3 hours was being spent each day. So there was a fair amount. I mean, I'm sure there's been other people who've made the comment during the conference that home learning and the time they spent on it doesn't actually equate to learning. We still don't know about that, and it's very hard even as parents to give an accurate representation of what was really going on during that time. But that's how long they spent doing their work. And I think the finding in regard to fathers that you're referring to is at around Christmas time, we asked whether, with hindsight, families felt closer as a result of having spent time in the pandemic, and they did. About 3/4 of families reported that, and it was particularly prevalent amongst the dads. So we might all need a little bit of space to process this, but I guess my takeaway from that is that it's not all bad, that there have been some benefits to the lockdown learning for some families. And we need to remember that when we're talking about the impacts of COVID on the younger generation.
Yeah, do you find any variation across types of families though, or across the country?
A little bit, but not as much as you'd expect. So we looked using eligibility for free school meals as a proxy for deprivation. And we found some differences. So children spent slightly less time on the schoolwork, but only by sort of 8 or 9%. It wasn't a big difference. Similarly, the parents said that they found their confidence in that in supporting their children during lockdown learning was a little bit lower for the parents whose children were eligible for free school meals, but not a lot, just again around 10%, no more than that.
Yeah.
We also measured anxiety on a weekly basis and looked at how that might be different between those with free school meals and those who are not. And it was really interesting. So it was clustered. Those who were eligible for free school meals had a lower level of anxiety and a higher level of anxiety, whereas those who were not eligible were much more in that middle category. So the pressures that they felt were more extreme, but also lower in some cases. And we think that it might be lower because the parents were at home. So thinking about what caused that anxiety, the causes of stress, we asked about this. And for parents whose children were eligible for free school meals, finances, money problems, the cost of schooling at home was what worried them, compared to those who were not on free school meals. And for them, their bigger concern was about how they're going to cope with their own work. So if you can think of the parents who might be spending all day working and trying to homeschool at the same time, that's a very different type of pressure to those who might not have a daytime job or might have been furloughed due to the lockdown and were able to support the homeschooling. So there were differences, but perhaps they're not as big as you might have expected.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen. I really appreciate you just pitching in like that.
Oh, I'm so sorry about the time
difference.
difference.
I think we've got all of you that we need in terms of information.
Tell you what,
at least.
I'm going to drive home. I'm going to turn my video off. I'm going to keep listening. And if I get home in time for the Q&A, maybe I can join in again.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I'll turn over to Anna now and ask you kind of the same questions. If you could, first of all, maybe talk a little bit about what homeschooling in the Netherlands looked like for parents.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what Karen described for the UK. So I think it was quite different how schools organized it, especially in the first lockdown. Maybe now it's a little bit more streamlined and organized. But I think they all provided some kind of work for the children to do at home, and then they provided different kinds of support from the schools. So that could be either some kind of video conference that Karen also talked about, either live or via little instruction videos that we also use in the higher education, and also different degrees of opportunities for the children to interact with teachers and parents and peers and to ask questions. So I think different.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what was expected of parents? I mean, maybe it's difficult to get that picture given that the Netherlands is a very decentralized system and every school will have had its own approach almost. But do you have an overview of what that would have looked like?
Yeah, so one thing I found consistently over all kinds of sources on the internet is that parents were not expected to be teachers. So I think that's important. But having said that, I think there were a lot of things that were expected from parents. So their main task would be like make children do the schoolwork that they got, but also they were encouraged to provide learning possibilities outside of that official schoolwork. So make use of internet sources or programs that were on the television or involve children in more informal forms of learning, involve them in chores that could promote learning like cooking or something like that. And I checked on the site of the Dutch Youth Institute, NJI, And they have a very long list of what parents could do during homeschooling. So also in addition to like the official tasks, also things like reduce stress, provide physical activities, talk with the child, provide emotional support, provide healthy food, structure, monitor screen time. So all kinds of responsibilities that came on top of like the normal responsibilities that parents had.
Yeah. So when I hear that long list, I can imagine that the level of stress for parents is quite high, or was quite high over the past year. And this is something that you measured. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so we measured subjective experiences of parents in terms of stress and satisfaction that they got from homeschooling. And also there we saw a wide range. So for some parents, it was more stressful than for others. And if I look at the average, it tended to go to the positive. So yeah, if you look on a scale from 1 to 10, so that would get a 6 for the experiences they had with homeschooling. So barely satisfactory, but yeah, towards the positive side.
Does that vary across families? Do you find any kind of background indicators, conditions that would kind of impact on their level of stress?
The things that we looked at, surprisingly enough, did not correlate with any of that subjective experiences. So neither did SES or number of children or migration background or any kinds of previous experiences that they had like before the pandemic with the teaching. But we did look at some child experiences and we saw some correlations there. So the more motivated the child was, the more positive the experience of the parent. And if the child had a preference for homeschooling rather than going to school, it was also more positive. So there might be more other predictors for that subjective experience than background variables, at least in our data.
Yeah, so it almost makes you think about what kind of personal characteristics of children would make that homeschooling a more fruitful experience almost. I mean, this is not my area of research. Is that something that you would know about?
It would be something I would like to look into next. So now we only focused on the previous experiences of the parents and contextual variables. But especially because, we found that the child characteristic at the same time of measurement had at least some correlation with that. That would be something I would want to look at in the future.
Yeah, it almost makes you think that the school environment is not the best place of learning for every child. I guess that's something that we see in assessment outcomes as well, where some students have actually done much better at home. So at least if you think about it from the perspective of learning outcomes in cognitive subjects, which is of course a very small and restricted view on what schooling is for. There are many other ways to have children go into schools, such as interaction with peers and learning how to engage with others, which is a very important element of school as well, obviously. But if we just look at it solely from the perspective of learning academic subjects, then maybe the school is not the best place for every child to be in, I guess. It might be a question to consider, I guess. You've also looked at the number of hours that parents actually spend on homeschooling. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that varies and whether that's, and what, if that's a good enough amount or not?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So time-wise, it's very similar to what Karen found in their study. So we saw that mothers spend about 3 hours on supervising homeschooling. Partners spend a little bit less, around 2 hours. And children themselves spend about 4 hours every day on average. But there was also a big range from 0 to 8 hours a day that we saw.
Yeah. And how does that vary by background of parents then?
No, we didn't find any correlations with that either. Although what Karen just said about the anxiety measure, that made me think that maybe we should look at it also differently, whether maybe there might be some differences in the low and in the high end, because we didn't check that now, but I could imagine that that could also be the case here, that, for example, the lower SES families, some spent more time at home, while others spent more time in critical work, for example.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering whether having 2 working parents would affect the amount of homeschooling. Is that something that you found, Anna?
We didn't actually look at that, but almost all parents in our sample are 2-parent families. So we have a very low risk sample in that regard, also with regard to SES differences. So we're mostly in the higher end. Yeah. So I don't think we have a lot of what Karen talked about, people who would be eligible for school meals. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the number of hours that they spend on homeschooling is also quite interesting, in that it makes you think that the amount of actual instructional time in schools would probably, I don't know, maybe perhaps be in the similar range, where many hours in the school are actually spent on other types of activities and not kind of dedicated on-task learning, perhaps.
Yeah.
Is that something that you could speak to as well?
Was that for me or for Karen? I didn't.
Yeah, for both of you, I guess.
I would be interested in hearing from somebody who has teaching experience, maybe how that would relate to actual hours working on task. I read a report from the NCO about here that there were actually some decreases in learning loss over the last years. So that would make you expect that maybe it wasn't enough, or maybe it wasn't qualitatively as good as what they would do at school. But I don't know, based on our findings, what to make of that, if it was enough or not.
Yeah. How about you, Karen? Can you respond to that? And then maybe if we have teachers in the audience, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, we don't have data on it either, but I've read some really interesting studies and just some narratives from parents thinking about kids who are either very high ability or lower ability, who are working outside of kind of the normal pace that you would get in class. And some of those kids worked a lot better, their parents say, during lockdown, because, you know, at the top end, they're not having to wait for everyone else. They might finish their work in 10 minutes, and they can see from the start of the day we found a lot of work was set kind of at the start of the day, and then kids could work through it at their own pace. And that really benefited those who work a lot faster or a lot slower than the norm. So it's really interesting. But as with Anna, there are a number of studies emerging across England that show that there have been quite significant learning losses, that kids aren't where you would expect them to be if it had been a normal year. Although one of the nice caveats that I've seen in those reports is that doesn't mean no learning happened, just a little less than normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe Karen, I can ask you to also share maybe the link to ParentPing in the chat, because I see that there are some questions on maybe more background to the work that you do. And I know that you are going to publish a report soon, but can't really share anything from that yet. But if we have the website, then we can keep a lookout to some of the data coming out from the UK. Maybe as a final question, Anna, I can also ask you if you could reflect on the role of fathers, particularly. Some of what Karen was talking about in that it's particularly fathers who've seen a maybe change in relationship with their child as a result of homeschooling. Is that something that we find in the Netherlands as well?
I thought that was really interesting and also a nice finding that not all has been bad, so that's nice. I don't know, we haven't looked at that data yet in our study. We do have some information about family relations and how that went during that whole period. However, what we did see was that mothers in our study did significantly more of the homeschooling and also worked less. And that concurs with findings from other studies as well, that maybe women are more negatively affected by the lockdown measures than men. So I'm not sure if we find these positive family effects as well, but I really hope that maybe some things have been set in motion during this whole thing, that things move towards better compatibility of work life and family life, for example, by making home office more available, especially for women as well, if they want to.
Yeah. And a final question from the chat. Thank you, Petri, for asking that. Maybe if I phrase it a bit more broader, do we know what strategies schools use to contact parents during COVID-19? I mean, in the Netherlands, initially we had quite a lot of discussion around children disappearing, so schools not being able to connect to children, but then probably also not being able to connect to their parents. Anna, that's from your work as well, and other work in the Institute, where the importance of the kind of homeschool partnership is really important. Do we know whether schools struggled with that, what they did to ensure that good relationship over the lockdown? How did that develop? Maybe you first.
Karen first.
Oh, right, yes.
Yeah.
So we don't know precisely how they were being contacted. I know they certainly used a whole range of different approaches to set the work for the children, predominantly via email, but also a lot of the different web-based platforms that schools are using. But one question we did ask, which perhaps gets to the nub of this question, is we asked parents how supported they felt by their schools. And actually, overwhelmingly, the parents responded very positively on that. So they did feel, on the whole, and again, we're talking about norms here and statistical majorities, rather, there will always be the outlier stories and the kids and the parents who had a dreadful time. But on the whole, the majority of parents felt very well supported by their schools.
Great. How about Netherlands, Anna?
Yeah, we also don't have the data about how they did it, but as you mentioned, like what we see in our data is that especially the resources that parents already have in terms of supporting learning at home, those are the things that predict also how well they did or adapted to the whole homeschooling situation. So that would be definitely something that I would like to support schools to do even after this situation, to better prepare parents and to make them more connected to what children actually do at school.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the lessons for all of us during the pandemic, I guess, is that you need to invest and build those relationships. And if you didn't have those in place before the pandemic, then trying to build those when a school is closed is probably going to be really difficult. So
Yeah.
I imagine that this will be kind of a reflection of what was in place before schools closed also. I guess that's the end of our session. Thank you. And thank you, Karen, especially for being so flexible.
Oh, I'm so sorry, I got the times wrong.
No, I'm really pleased that you were able to connect in the end. So thank you for sharing your time with us. And thank you, Anne, for your reflections from the Netherlands as well, and everyone for joining in the conversation. We have a final keynote by Dirk van Damme, who was previously at the OECD but just recently retired. I'm really looking forward to his talk as well. So I hope to see you in the final session as well. Yeah. See you at the session, hopefully.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie.
Bye.
Bye.